Engineer Gold Mines is focused on the exploration and development of the historic high-grade Engineer Gold Mine situated 32 kilometers southwest of Atlan, British Columbia. Engineer Gold Mines is fully permitted for surface and underground exploration with the drill program now underway. Engineer Gold Mines Limited trades on the TSX Venture Exchange, symbol EAU. For more information, please visit us at engineergoldmines.com.
Welcome to the Goddard Report. Comments made on the Goddard Report and TalkDigitalNetwork.com are an expression of opinion only. Here is Jim Goddard.
My guest is Chris Sims, BC Director of the Canadian Taxpayers Federation, her website taxpayer.com. Welcome back to the show, Chris.
Thanks for having us.
The city of Vancouver is looking at what they call mobility pricing, congestion pricing. They want to charge you a lot of money to go into the downtown core. But that's not the only cost of this idea or program. I know the City of London does it, but that's for anywhere between 8 and 12 million people. Vancouver's certainly not that big. What's your problem with charging cars extra to just drive into Vancouver, let alone park?
Oh, we have so many problems with this. People can't afford it. Vancouver is frankly one of the most least affordable cities on planet Earth. You know, newsflash to City Hall politicians and bureaucrats, get your heads out of the sand. You need to stop doing this. Average people who need to drive into work, who need to drive to get their groceries, who need to use their cars, it's already extremely difficult to navigate around Vancouver because they've clogged up a lot of their major arteries with construction that seems to never end, with bike lanes that are ill-planned. And I'm not anti-bike lane, but there's a good place for them and a bad place for them. And quite often motorists will say there's a heck of a lot of bad places that they're picking for these narrowing of their main street arteries. On top of that, parking costs an arm and a leg, and there's taxes on top of the parking. So Vancouver already is at war with the car, and now they're trying to build a toll wall around downtown Vancouver. The last time around when they had this program put in front of Vancouver City Hall, Canadian Taxpayers Federation was one of the witnesses. We gave our piece there. They were planning on having it stretch from Clark all the way over to Burrard, and it was going to be bordered on the south by West 12th, so right near City Hall, and it was going to be bordered on the north by the ocean. So they were planning on building the toll wall down there. So they would cut off City Hall, it would cut off Vancouver General Hospital, it would cut off the main library branch. Like, all of these essential public government services for average people would now be behind the toll wall. On top of that, just countless small businesses that are already hanging on by their fingernails would then be built behind this toll wall. What they're also trying to do is they're trying to hide how much it'll cost. But unfortunately for them, Metro Vancouver and TransLink already studied this thing. They already blew more than $2 million studying what they called mobility pricing back then. The report came out a few years ago. Some of your listeners might remember Joy McPhail spearheading it. The CTF was there too as part of the stakeholder group, and we gave our piece there. And back then, that's when they came out with ideas of tolling all the major bridges. And it wasn't going to be cheap. So they were planning on charging you up to $6 one way going in on the Port Mann, the Queensboro, the Patello in the morning, and more than $8 on the way home in the afternoon. So during peak rush hour, that's $14 a day plus. So you do that times 5 days a week, times 50 weeks a year, if you're trying to take a bit of vacation. That's more than $3,000 a year just in tolls. And that was their previous plan. That was for Metro Vancouver. And so now they're mirroring that as they're studying this in downtown Vancouver. And, Jim, they're spending $1 million in taxpayers' money on a consultant for it. So he or she gets to plan where they're going to put the wall.
Well, so they're not even willing to look at this $2 million study.
No.
Which was apparently shot down. Now, are they thinking about small businesses at all where already, and this goes back 11 years ago, people in Vancouver, because the city wouldn't allow big box stores for the most part, apparently a study done by the city of Vancouver found 50,000 Vancouver residents were leaving the city every weekend to shop elsewhere where they could park for free and put a lot of items in the back of their vehicle. Or say you have 5 kids, which of course I think nowadays people don't think of, but there are still large families out there. There's a lot of communities in Vancouver where they'll have 5 or 6 kids. How are you going to carry all those groceries on your bicycle back home?
Well, frankly, this is one of the reasons why the city of Surrey is one of the fastest growing municipalities in Canada, because they don't treat their people like this yet. So this kind of ridiculous war on the car thinking can infect other places, but right now, knock wood, it's not. It's mostly contained to downtown Vancouver. And you're right, and I've got nothing against people who ride bikes. I did it for 13 years in downtown Ottawa, but I didn't need to haul my entire family around on my bike with my groceries and whatnot, and I'm currently able-bodied. Some people aren't. They aren't able to walk and bike everywhere that they want to. Some of them need to get to medical appointments. We've heard from seniors who need to get to their doctors downtown. There's a million reasons. People live complicated lives. There's a million reasons why they need to have their own vehicle. And it's personal, and it's part of their freedom of movement. But Vancouver is just going for it. The other element here is how they're going to collect the money. Now, the couple of the proposals that we were privy to back when they first studied this again a couple of years ago, they were planning on putting a whole bunch of cameras, like hundreds and hundreds of them, all around Metro Vancouver, that would have license plate readers on them. So poof, poof, poof. As you drive past them, you get dinged. You get sent a bill. And or they were actually talking about putting tracking devices in your car by way of government rule. So through ICBC or transport, however they'd figured that out. So they could track your movements and then charge you based on where you're moving around. How that would possibly stand up to a charter challenge of not being constantly observed by the state, I don't know. But we were one of the only groups that opposed it. Everybody else thought it was kind of a hunky-dory thing to do, in the sense of if you've got nothing to hide, why bother? So number one, this is extremely expensive. People can't afford it. And two, it could be really intrusive.
Does Vancouver have a congestion problem like London, England?
No, and we are not London, England. What's interesting is that, as you point out rightly, London, England is way bigger in population. Just totally bigger than Vancouver. And two, London, England has one of the oldest and most extensive rapid transit systems on planet Earth. So when you are right in downtown London, you can jump on the tube and go lots of places. You know, New York City isn't as extensive, but man, you can get around downtown pretty easily on the subway. We don't have that in Vancouver, nor could we afford to try to replicate it. People just don't have the money. So there isn't that option. And what's weird is that all of these fancy folks down at City Hall, they like to breezily reference places like London. Oh, well, London, England has this. You know what they leave out? They leave out these three things. One, London's way bigger. Two, London has a transit system that can at least manage it a little bit. And three, how expensive it is. It costs an average person who's not driving a brand new car in London more than $50 Canadian per day to get to downtown London.
By the way, in London, you're given a pay bonus because London is so expensive. They actually factor that into your pay.
For cost of living, wow.
Yes. Well, not just cost of living, because they know transit's expensive. To buy lunch in downtown London is expensive. You get an allowance, a bonus on top of your regular salary to take that into account. Are Vancouver businesses willing to do that?
They can't afford it. You know, the folks, and especially after COVID with what's happened. And just think of all these delivery groups now that have to do takeout and delivery and all that stuff. What happens when they're on the inside of the wall? And I need to warn folks, that most of the bean counters down at Vancouver City Hall, they don't want this to stay between Clark and Burrard. They want all of Metro Vancouver to adopt this. So they are pressuring your mayors. If you're living in a place like Port Coquitlam or Langley or Surrey or Delta, they're twisting their arms right now to adopt this line of thinking and to impose these forms of tolls on pre-existing roads in your community. So you need to pick up the phone, you need to send an email, and you need to talk to your mayor and ask him or her if they're on board with this.
Well, the Lower Mainland already is the only place, I think, in North America that pays a transit tax to the Transit Authority, TransLink, something like 18.5 cents a liter, isn't it?
It is, 18.5 cents a liter. There's also a TransLink tax on parking. There's also actually a TransLink tax factored in on property. So private property in Vancouver, you pay an extra TransLink tax on top of that in Vancouver. In Montreal, speaking of places that have a gigantic underground subway system and a transit system that's quite extensive, their transit tax is around 5 cents a liter. So nothing even comparable to the 18.5 cents a liter. By the way, TransLink is keeping up their gold-plated plans. The new CEO that they just hired is starting at $450,000 per year. So all these pleas and everything of try to go smaller, try to find somebody who's more affordable now that Kevin Desmond is gone. They're starting this guy at $450 per year.
And where are they from?
They're coming from the States. As last I checked, he was from the metro area around Washington, D.C.
We'll have more with Chris Sims right after this.
Media recognition from Bloomberg, Reuters, recycling trade publications, patented process for 100% recovery of critical metals, including cobalt, lithium, nickel, manganese, aluminum. American Manganese is focused on recycling lithium-ion batteries for electric vehicles. American Manganese trades on the TSX Venture, AMY, the US, AMYZF, and Frankfurt 2AM. For more information, visit AmericanManganeseInc.com or phone me, Larry Ray, at 778-574-4444.
Don't miss out. Stay informed. Receive the HowStreet.com weekly recap with thought-provoking podcasts, radio, and articles delivered to your inbox. Sign up for the HowStreet.com weekly recap on our homepage at HowStreet.com.
Welcome back. We're speaking with Chris Sims. Chris, something that caught, I think, everybody's attention, and I think I saw a post from you about it. Air Canada giving $10 million in bonuses to its executives after the Canadian government, the taxpayers, bailed them out to the tune of billions. And apparently the government got some kind of promise they wouldn't be dishing out these bonuses. The excuse being, well, they were scheduled just before the government deal.
This is the thing. This is amateur hour, and we don't have amateurs in government. This is almost wholly the responsibility of Prime Minister Justin Trudeau and Chrystia Freeland, the finance minister. They should have been kicking the tires on this big time before they did two things. Before they bailed them out, which is technically supposed to be a loan, so that's a good thing, and before they gave the wage subsidy, the emergency COVID wage subsidy, to Air Canada. But they didn't. They didn't ask these questions, apparently. It didn't come up in negotiations. So what is your current schedule as far as executive bonus pay? Nothing like that. So this is on them. They should have been doing their due diligence. So they can sit there in question period and throw their hands in the air and say, oh, well, how terrible. No. This is not their first rodeo. They should have been on top of this. And even if you wanted to give the elected politicians, Trudeau and Freeland, a pass on this, they have unelected, long-time, decades-working bureaucrats in the Treasury Department, in the Finance Department, whose main job it is to sign corporate welfare checks. This is what they do. They scoop out taxpayers' money and they hand it to companies. So they should have been on top of this and advising the minister and all of the staff to make sure that this wasn't the case. And so Canadians have every right to be super ticked off at both the government and Air Canada over this.
Shouldn't Air Canada face some kind of penalty? Because it seems semi-fraudulent what they did. I'm being generous.
Well, if it wasn't in the deal, depends on what the wording is of the deal. I'll be very curious to see how extensive and carefully worded that bailout, which is still, again, technically supposed to be a loan, so that's good, but in particular, how much the emergency wage subsidy. I want to know what the language is on that deal, because maybe they just didn't do their homework. If they just left it, carte blanche, then Air Canada is going to take advantage of it. Again, this is the government's job to be diligent and careful and prudent with our money, and it's the opposite.
I read an editorial in one of our national newspapers that said the current federal government is loaded with nothing but amateurs, and they need to bring in expert consultants on virtually everything at the cost of tens of millions of dollars because they don't have business experience or experience in their particular portfolio, so they have to hire these very expensive people. And if they did hire expensive people, why didn't they do a better job of negotiating this deal with Air Rip-Off Canada?
Darn good question. And just think, this is on top of the growing bureaucracy. The last stat I read was that since Prime Minister Trudeau was elected in 2015-2016, that the bureaucracy in in Ottawa-Gatineau, capital region, has grown more than 20%. So that's your rank-and-file bureaucrat, that's your expert bureaucrat, you name it. There's all sorts of special tiers that they're in at. So on top of that 20-something% growth in the body of the government and bureaucracy, they're also hiring outside consultants hand over fist because they can't get the work done. This is not accountable. People of all stripes should be demanding much, much better, and they should be phoning their MPs about it, like weekly.
Now, the media giant companies in Canada, are they still getting giant subsidies from the federal government?
The last we checked, yes, they are. And this is going to become a problem because they're going to become hooked on it. And no matter what, I'll just speak as a former journalist, that affects you. If you know where your bread is being buttered, that you may not want to admit it to yourself, but it will psychologically affect you. You always do keep in mind who's signing your checks because you don't want to get fired. You also want to be a team player, and you want to stick within, it's almost like a corporate culture. So you know, when you're a reporter on the beat or when you're an announcer, you know what lines to stay inside of, and now they're getting money from the federal government. That's going to bother them. That's going to compromise their integrity, even if they fight against it. And even if they're fighting against it, it'll bother them. It'll bother them. Most journalists would be really bothered by the idea of having taxpayers' money helping to pay their checks. And so that'll eat at them. And frankly, taxpayers shouldn't be footing these bills. We have to keep in mind that some of these media companies are gigantic. They make billions of dollars per year. It should be on them to provide good local paying jobs in their news departments and staffing up their newsrooms and providing news content and investigative journalism that people want to pay for. So for example, you've got this great podcast. You don't have to, rely on the government in that way. There's other fantastic independent journalism websites like Blacklock's Reporter in Ottawa. They don't take money from taxpayers. People rely on them for great guests, good podcasts, investigative original journalism. So if the big guys are taking handouts, it's only going to erode trust in the mainstream media further.
Kimberly Fawcett, an armed forces officer with Canada, lost her leg on the way to work. And for, I think, 10, 15 years, the government fought giving her any kind of compensation for it. She's now won her case. She's still with the armed forces. Good for her. And she's working for the country for way below what that market value skill is. Why would the government fight so long for somebody who obviously lost their leg in the line of duty?
That's a great question. We ran across this I think every party runs into this. Sometimes the bureaucracy and the government will just have these lawyers and they dig their teeth in and they just keep fighting and fighting and fighting. And I'm not sure why. You'd think that there'd eventually be, cut your losses, so to speak, of fight it for a little while if you truly believe that you're not in the wrong or that it would cost too much money or fill in the blank, in order to deter, nuisance lawsuits, something like that. Sure. But 10, 15 years, that's just such a long period of time. They should really revisit this. Perhaps this is something that Government Operations Committee, along with the Treasury Board, needs to have full hearings about. And we're not talking about paying extra. They already have the mechanisms to do this on Parliament Hill in committee. Perhaps they should have a joint committee, and they should really analyze this and find out, one, are we treating people right in these situations? And two, is this the best use of our time and money and energy? And if those are both no, then they need to fix this. They need to figure out a way of limiting the amount of time they're spending in court.
Yes, Kimberly lost her leg and her only child in a car accident while reporting for duty in Afghanistan. 15 years of getting, compensation for the use of a prosthetic leg, which, by the way, your provincial medical health plan does not pay for. You have to come up with the cash for it yourself. Those don't come cheap, 30, 40 grand?
Mm-hmm. And quite often you'll need replacements and upgrades depending on your usage, yes.
So I'm glad she's still with the armed forces, the kind of attitude that we need there. Now, we still have Bill C-10, the attempt to censor the internet. Is that still going ahead with the government?
Yes, and in fact, they're trying to stifle debate on it. So what that means is right now they're debating it. So at different times in the House of Commons, members of Parliament from all parties will attend, both physically and virtually, and they will say their piece of, yes, I agree with this, no, I don't. That's how the debate works. Right now, the government is trying to shut that down and invoke closure. And what that means is they have to stop talking. MPs that you elected from all parts of Canada would have to stop talking about this, and they want to ram it through before the session ends and before they go on their summer break. And if they do that, it'll become law. This is a really bad law, so much so that former CRTC commissioners are saying that it is a problem and it's an attack on free speech and the basis of our democracy. And Michael Geist doesn't throw words around like that easily, and that's some of the language he's using. What this would do potentially is have it so that bureaucrats who work at the CRTC would decide whether or not your content, if it's audio, visual, what have you, online, is good or bad, and they can either make sure that it doesn't show up, or they can change it so that it doesn't show up as often. So it's almost dampening effect. This is extremely dangerous because this is an attack on free speech. Now, to be clear, we already have laws against hate speech in Canada. So you can't go on, the internet or on the media or whatnot, or yell it from a street corner, awful things, like racist things, invoking injury upon another identifiable group. All of those things are crimes if you're convicted of them. So all of that is already on the books. So why are they looking to interfere with people's own expressions online over and above that? So this is a major issue, and the reason why the Canadian Taxpayers Federation is fighting it tooth and nail is because this will limit groups' ability to hold governments to account. So I'll give you an example. Back, during the invasion of Iraq by former U.S. President George W. Bush, there were gigantic protests throughout North America against this. One of those big protests was on Parliament Hill. It was in January back then. I think it was 2003. The way that the word of mouth was spread about that protest was largely through left-wing activist groups, not totally left-wing, but mostly left-wing activist groups online. There were message boards, there were emails, there was video, there was audio, all that stuff. They organized for about 6 weeks leading up to it. They had a massive turnout. Thousands and thousands of people came out, and they protested on Parliament Hill. A few days later, Prime Minister Jean Chrétien stood up in the House of Commons and said, no, we're not going. Canada's not going to get involved. So even if you may be, a big right-winger now, what happens if somebody gets in and they don't like your right-wing speech? And vice versa. If you're left-wing, what happens if a hardcore right-winger gets in and they get to decide what your expression is online? This is a huge threat to freedom of expression online, and everybody should be very concerned about it.
The CRTC has approved charging small internet providers bigger fees than the big companies. How's this not an attack on free speech?
It's another major problem. It's why bureaucrats and regulators should be doing as minimal as possible on any of these fields. You need to allow for the free exchange of ideas, for people to have freedom of choice on what kind of a provider that they want to pay for, all of that. So again, when you add more government, you almost always make things worse and more cluttered up, and they'll try to say that, it's good intentions, but we know what the road to hell is paved with. So I urge everybody, like I said, even if you are right or left wing, it doesn't matter. Do you want the next government, whoever that might be, deciding what you can say online and what kind of providers you can get for your online sources? If the answer is no, you pick up the phone and you call them. And I urge, for example, the Conservatives, as of right now, are against C10. The NDP's kind of mixed on it. The Bloc sounds like they're going to be supporting the Liberals. So if you live in an NDP riding, for example, I would definitely have a heart-to-heart with your MP and tell them why you don't want C10 passed, for the very reason I explained. If folks hadn't had that protest on Parliament Hill back during the Iraq War, who knows? Maybe that wouldn't have influenced the Prime Minister at the time. Maybe we would have sent Canadian forces in, and maybe history would be different. So the ability to organize, to assemble, to say your piece freely is fundamental to our democracy in Canada on every issue. And so we can't have Bill C-10 passed.
Chris, anything else you wanted to bring up during the show?
I wanted to urge people, again, no matter what party you're with, to really pay attention to this stuff. Because right now, COVID, it's a combination of COVID and a lack of reporters in newsrooms. And it's a body issue. There are far fewer journalists in newsrooms across Canada now. So whereas there used to be, for example, 2 reporters, imagine this, 2 reporters on the softwood lumber beat working for the Vancouver Sun in the mid-90s, just imagine that. Now there's like a handful of them in the entire newsroom. It's been decimated across Canada. And so those two things combined, a massive crisis like COVID combined with a lack of boots on the ground when it comes to independent journalism, is allowing bad things like Bill C-10 to sneak in under the radar. So I urge folks, try to read as widely as you can, listen to podcasts like this, try to read blogs and news sites that are a little different to really garner as much information as you can, and be active. Call your MP, call your MLA. You let them know that you're monitoring their behavior so that they can't do this under this fog.
Chris, thank you so much for chatting with us.
Thank you for caring.
My guest has been Chris Sims, BC Director of the Canadian Taxpayers Federation. Her website, taxpayer.com. Chris, is there an email people can contact you at?
Yes, they can contact me directly anytime. My email address is ksims. So that's the letter KSIMS at taxpayer.com. I would love to hear from them.
And if you have questions for Chris, you can also pass them on to us at info@howstreet.com, and we'll ask the question for you. Our popular YouTube channel is Talk Digital Network. Find us on Twitter at TalkDigitalNet. We're also on Facebook. I'm Jim Goddard. Thank you for listening.
Comments made on the Goddard Report and TalkDigitalNetwork.com are an expression of opinion only. The Goddard Report is available online and mobile at TalkDigitalNetwork.com. The Goddard Report is a production of Howe Street Media Incorporated.